Welcome, little darlings, to my world again of granny tales in my library, in my little house, like a little old lady, little old granny, like's in this book. This book is called Rainbow Magic and it's by Shirley Barber. It's also another old book. It was given to Erin back in 1996. There's lots of beautiful little pictures in this book. I hope you enjoy it. Once upon a time there was an old lady called Gran Tibbet. She lived in an old house at the edge of the forest with her granddaughter, Annie Tibbet, and little dog Bozo. Around the house was Granny Tibbet's pretty rose garden, and around the rose garden was a grassy meadow that went right to the edge of the dark fern forest. Early in the morning the deer and the fawns would come out of the forest and eat grass in the meadow. Sometimes Annie could get quite close to a fawn, but little dog Bozo would run out and bark at the big deer. "One day they won't run away," Andy scolded. "Then you'll be sorry," but little dog Bozo only laughed. See little dog Bozo down here? When the weather was cold, Gran Tibbet's knee joints stiffened and her elbows creaked and everything that could ache began to ache. Then Gran would sigh and sadly say, "I'm getting old, and I'm good and ready for my heavenly reward, but who will take care of you when I'm gone to glory?" Annie and little dog Bozo were not really worried because they thought Gran would go on being Gran forever. They built houses of dried fern fronds and made leaf boats and sailed them on the still water. A big fish lived in the pool, and if they kept very still he rose to look at them. But Bozo always barked, and with a splash the fish would be gone. On showery days, Annie sometimes saw a rainbow so close she called to Gran, "Shall I run and see if I can find the fairy's crook of gold at the end of the rainbow?" But Gran said, "You keep away from rainbows, Annie. They are very funny things. You can get caught under rainbows and never come home again." One day, when Annie and little dog Bozo were playing in Fern Forest, it began to rain. They crept into a hollow tree. Soon the sun shone again, and suddenly a big, beautiful rainbow came curving out of the sky and touched the mossy ground in front of them. They stared in astonishment. Just inside the rainbow was a crook filled with gold. "Oh," cried Annie, "what a lovely present to take home to Gran." She forgot all about Gran Tibbet's warning, and she and little dog Bozo ran to pick up the crook of gold. But as they went under the rainbow, something very strange happened. They grew smaller and smaller and changed into two tiny fairy folk. Both Annie and little dog Bozo now had wings and were so small that the grass blades were as tall as to them as trees. "Oh, Bozo," cried Annie, "how will we find our way home to Gran and tell her what has happened to us?" She sat down under a toadstool and began to cry. Little dog Bozo tried to fly with his new wings, but instead he fell down, head over paws, look at him here, into a violet bed, and he couldn't help laughing. "We won't be able to fly home till you've had some practice," she said. "Come along, Bozo, we'll have a walk." The crook of gold, which had looked so big through the rainbow, was small now, so Annie put it into her lunch bag, and off they set. They walked and walked until they met a family of deer. To the two fairy folk, the deer were as big as mountains, the biggest deer in the whole world. Little dog Bozo ran out and barked at them, as he had always done, but these deer didn't run away. The smallest fawn frightened Bozo, so he hid behind Annie. "We must go home another way," she said. They came to the deep, dark pond with a huge fish swimming in it. "Is that the fish we used to watch?" whispered Annie to Bozo. "He looks big enough to eat us now. How shall we get across?" Just then a frog came out from his moss-covered house near the bank and offered to ferry them across the water. "What a nice boat," Annie said to Bozo. "It reminds me of something. Why, I do believe it's one of the boats we made when we were playing here. Now we know what become of them. The frogs took them." When they reached the other bank, they thanked the frog and gave him a biscuit from her lunch bag. The sun went down and the forest filled with shadows. Annie and little dog Bozo began to feel frightened. Suddenly a family of mice came scurrying along the path, scaring Bozo, but the mice were friendly and warned the two new fairy folk that the big wild cat was out hunting. "Hurry, he's coming," they said. "Follow us." So Annie and little dog Bozo went home with the mice for supper. They had grasshopper pie and toasted midges. Yummy! And Annie broke up some biscuits to give to the baby mice. Then they all went to sleep together, tucked up small and warm in a soft bed of thistledown. See them down here. When the moon rose, the mice ran out to dance in the moonlight, but Annie and little dog Bozo did not wait till sunrise. Next morning, the two new fairy folk set off on their long walk home. But before long, they realised they were quite lost. The sun grew hotter and hotter, and the ground grew damper and damper. Annie was admiring the beautiful flowers all around them, and little dog Bozo was splashing through ponds and frisking ahead. When, "Help, help, help," he screamed. He was caught fast in a sticky leaf of sundew and simply couldn't pull free. Luckily, Mr. Prickles came rumbling and snuffing along. Annie was very frightened, but Mr. Prickles looked down at poor little dog Bozo and laughed. "Ha, ha," he said. Then he rooted him out with his long nose and went off chuckling and snuffing along the track. Look at his big long nose. There were so many dangers when you're small, sighed Annie. If only we knew how to fly. A bluebird flew down beside them, and Annie asked him, "Please, can you show us how to fly home?" The bird said he didn't know how to teach fairy folk to fly, but he said they could come and stay the night with his family. So Annie and little dog Bozo went home to the bluebird's nest and had tea. They had moth cakes and ant cookies and drank tea out of flower cups. Annie broke up the last of her biscuits and gave them to the baby birds. Then they all sat on a wild rose branch and sang songs till the time for bed. Next day, the bluebird said he had found a wise old Mr. Longlegs who knew almost everything about everything. There he is there. Who looked at them thoughtfully when he'd heard their story. "I think you'd better meet Fairy King and Queen and all the other fairy folk," he said. "Little folk just like yourselves live in the ferny glade by the waterfall just down the path." Annie and Bozo felt so happy to know there were other little people just like themselves. They thanked the bluebird and the wise old bird and ran towards the waterfall which sparkled between the trees. But suddenly that wicked wild cat pounced on little dog Bozo and was about to eat him when... "Stop that at once," a voice commanded. "Put down the fairy person." It was the Fairy King. The cat sulkily put down little dog Bozo and skulked away. Then the Fairy King led them to the fairy court, where they met the Fairy Queen. In the ferny glade, they gathered all those who had gone under rainbows at one time or another. The king explained that because Annie and Bozo had not listened to Grand Tibbet's warning, they would now be fairy folk forever and ever. They must learn to be good fairy folk just like the others. Then all the fairies, elves, pixies and funny things came forward to greet them. Annie and Bozo had flying lessons with a new friend, Funny Thing Beetle. Mrs. Rabbit taught them what was good to eat and what was not, and lots of other useful things, like where to find honey and how to make flower seed cookies. An old gnome showed the new fairy folk how to build a house in a tree, and Annie and little dog Bozo soon built a beautiful little home. Funny Thing Beetle failed his house building test when his house fell down, so Annie and little dog Bozo let him share their home because they felt so sorry for him. At last Annie asked the Fairy King if they could visit Grand Tibbet. The King and Queen wanted to see Gran's rose garden, so all the court winged their way through the fern forest till they came to Grand Tibbet's old house. Gran was sitting in the twilight, feeling very sad. She had given up all hope of ever seeing Annie and little dog Bozo again. Suddenly she looked up and saw a tiny little Annie and a weeny little dog Bozo alight upon her veranda rail. There they are there. Behind them, all the fairies fluttered down to picnic in her rose garden. "Look, Gran," cried Annie, "we're safe after all, but we have to be fairy folk for ever and ever. We're well and happy, and we've brought a present for you, a crock of gold we found under the rainbow." So Annie and little dog Bozo and their friend Funny Thing Beetle lived with the fairy folk forever, but they often come to talk to Gran while the fairy court picnicked in the rose garden. Gran stopped worrying about who would look after Annie and little dog Bozo after she'd gone to glory, because she knew that now they could look after themselves. And what about the crook of gold? Of course, it was only a fairy-sized crook of gold, so Gran set it in a mantelpiece in a tiny glass case, just to prove that fairy folk did live in the fern forest and that there really was a crock of gold to be found under the rainbow. Look at all the little mice having fun. Hope you enjoyed that little fairy tale. Good night all.